I think since the day that I got my email that I got accepted into medicine, I spent the entire holidays literally thinking about what that first week of med school would be like. You barely know much about med school. I felt nervous, but also really thrilled to get back into uni for some reason. I couldn't wait for orientation week, um, going to the new campus, seeing the new cohort of students. But then COVID hit and we went back into lockdown and we went back to good old Zoom. So once you get into med school, it is a 5-year degree. Med school starts 1 week earlier than every other degree, and that's because we have our orientation week. So on the first day, the Monday, the first lecture that we had was basically an overall introduction of the entire med school program. So they placed an emphasis on letting us know that years 2 and 3 are called your preclinical years, and they are primarily like learning the theoretical stuff, spending most of the time in labs and lectures, whereas from years 4 to 6, those are known as your clinical years, and you spend most of the time in hospitals getting that practical experience. We were then introduced to all the staff involved in the medical program, such as the head of the medical program, the year 2 director, different kind of support services. I think since the day that I got my email that I got accepted into medicine, I spent the entire holidays literally thinking about what that first week of med school would be like. You barely know much about med school. I felt nervous, but also really thrilled to get back into uni for some reason. I couldn't wait for orientation week, going to the new campus, seeing the new cohort of students. But then COVID hit and we went back into lockdown and we went back to good old Zoom. They tell us in second year because we need them. So once you get into med school, it is a 5-year degree. Med school starts 1 week earlier than every other degree, and that's because we have our orientation week. So on the first day, the Monday, the first lecture that we had was basically an overall introduction of the entire med school program. So they placed an emphasis on letting us know that years 2 and 3 are called your preclinical years, and they are primarily like learning the theoretical stuff, spending most of the time in labs and lectures, whereas from years 4 to 6, those are known as your clinical years, and you spend most of the time in hospitals getting that practical experience. We were then introduced to all the staff involved in the medical program, such as the head of the medical program, the year 2 director, different kind of support services under the Faculty of Medical and Health Sciences. There were a lot of people to be introduced to, and it was really overwhelming, and I don't think I remembered a single name, but it's because each person has like a very specific role that they do. Next thing we moved on to was about the vaccination requirements. Now, to be a clinical student, you need to have your vaccines all up to date. So chickenpox, Boostrix, Hep B, hepatitis B, COVID, and all like the booster shots. And that's because they tell us in second year because we need them for when we start clinical year, so year 4. But we got to start doing all the blood tests and stuff early on because it does take quite a bit of time. And the main reason we have to do this is once we get into hospitals, it's not only just for our protection, but to protect the patients themselves, because we don't want to be transferring disease from one person to another. They also talked about the different kinds of student clubs will be like the #1 support system for university students. So for medicine, there's a big club called UMSA, Auckland University Medical Students Association, and they provide a lot of like academic and social events. We have NZMSA, New Zealand Medical Students Association. So they organize like all the national conferences between Auckland and Otago. And we also have Grassroots, which has a huge focus on rural health because that is also extremely important. We were also introduced to the Mbch Portal, which has a lot of links and different pages, so it's a bit hard to navigate, but it gives us access to things like short answer questions, professional and personal development resources, lots of databases for our learning, and just a lot of resources that will help us through our entire journey in med school. We ended the day at 1 p.m. on Monday because they had told us to come in to campus to collect our Musculoskeletal course guide, which we can get as a physical copy. And so that was really great because, as I said, everything was on Zoom, so being able to go into campus and see all our friends after like the entire summer holidays and catch up and like see the Grafton campus. It was really nice. It was also the time to get our new student IDs, because apparently our student IDs will just have like medical student at the top, so we had to collect that as well. I ended the day watching the pre-recorded recording of the Whakanoa. So we are extremely privileged to be able to have the experience of learning using cadavers. They are basically the first human body that we will come across in our medical career, and so the Whakanoa is like a very important process where we are respecting the dignity of the person as well as the family who would have sacrificed a lot to give up their loved ones to the university. And so it's basically a Maori ritual where once death happens, the body enters a state of sacredness. And so what the Whakanoa does is it removes any religious or spiritual restrictions of this tapu in a respectful manner, and also gives us blessings. And so that's basically what we did on the first day. Now let's move on to Tuesday. So on Tuesday we started the morning at 9 a.m. with a lecture introducing to us a module that we will have throughout the entire year called Professional and Clinical Skills. Now this encompasses both theoretical lectures that talk about mindfulness, inequities, alcohol and drugs, mental health, varied or ethics as well. And then we also have another side to it, which consists of our small group activities, where it's just like discussion based with groups of 10 to 12 people. And we also have clinical skills, where we learn like practical skills. And then they also introduced all the different assessments throughout the year. So you would have to like, you know, write portfolio pieces and reflections this year and next year. The next lecture was on a brief overview of the entire second year. So the different kind of modules we will be doing, how long each module will be, introducing progress tests, which is this test that we do 3 times a year, and you have to do it every single year, so from years 2 to 6. And the aim is that once you are in year 6, you should be able to pass it. So you should be able to get 50%. So as you can imagine, in year 2, you'd basically not know much to be able to get a high grade, but that's completely fine because it's aimed for a year 6 student knowledge. And then they also talked about what like PSTs are, the practical skills test, and also the end of module tests. Then in the afternoon, we had our very first lecture, which was on the different kinds of imaging modalities. So we can have, you know, CT scans, x-rays, ultrasounds, MRIs, etc. This lecture was mainly just to introduce us to that and to have as a backup resources if we want to, you know, go into learning more about the different scans, but it wasn't really assessed though. On Wednesday, the day started with another PCS lecture, and that was on code of conduct. So it was basically how the responsibilities and obligations we have as a medical student and also as a future doctor. And so they made us like sign this form saying that we accept it. But basically the 4 things that they talked about were interactions with patients and whānau, relationships with staff and colleagues, personal and professional expectations, and also commitment to continuing improvement in practice, self, and others. Then we moved on to a lecture called Safe Doctors. The lecturer was reading out stories from anonymous doctors who were explaining like the good and the bad experiences that they've had. It was actually quite eye-opening. Doctors have high rates of depression and suicide. They emphasize the importance of like knowing how to manage stress, knowing how to maintain a healthy well-being, and just looking out for everyone in our cohort, making sure that everyone's okay while they're going through this journey. And we just had discussions around all those topics. Then we ended the day with a suturing lab, and that was pretty cool. It was kind of sad that we didn't get to do it in person. We were just watching the lecturer do it, but it was still really cool to see. We were introduced to all the different kinds of tools that they use for surgery, what their name is, when to use which one. And then we watched the lecturer like just suture on pig skin, and he was teaching us like the different kinds of suturing techniques and when you would use them. Really interesting. Yeah, we ended the day with that. And now let's move on to Thursday. We had a lecture in the morning on the topic of becoming a doctor, what doctors do and how do you get there. And so they covered what happens during med school, And then they also covered what happens once you've graduated. So what's the process through the hospital, you know, how to specialize, etc. And so they showed us like what kind of specialties there are. They actually showed this interesting picture of what kind of person would suit which kind of specialty. And it doesn't include all the specialties, but it was just like a basic overview. We also had 2 guest speakers come in. One was a doctor who worked in a rural clinic setting, and then another one was a GP. And so they both shared like what they did to get where they were right now, what kind of opportunities they took up, and just like their journey in general. In the afternoon, we had our first lecture on the musculoskeletal system, and it was actually about skin. So we learned the basic anatomy of skin and also looked into different diseases, so like a bit of dermatology. And then we ended the day learning how to use a microscope properly, so how to turn it on, how to you know, focus, how to prevent damage to the microscope. And this was because once we get back into in-person learning, we would be having to use a microscope quite regularly. And so it's just like a refresher, because you would have learned how to use a microscope in first year as well. Now moving on to Friday, from the get-go, this day was actually quite content heavy. We started the day with a musculoskeletal lecture, and this was a brief overview of the entire module, so the different things that we'd be talking about, advice and tips from previous students, especially because they also did online exams, so that was something to take into consideration. Just a heads up that it would be really content heavy, and to not fall behind. They kept stressing this point because it is very anatomy heavy. And we moved on to learning basic terminology, such as like the anatomical position, anterior, posterior, dorsal, ventral, lateral, medial, different kinds of movements that you would call, so like, you know, abduction, adduction, external rotation, internal rotation, just different things, yeah. We started learning about the pectoral girdles, so that's basically what connects your upper limbs, so your arms, to the axis of the body, so like the chest area. And so that consists of like your clavicle, your scapula, your coracoid. We also then had our first HAL lab, so they introduced us to a couple of the cadavers, and we were basically observing their skin. So we had to look out for things such as scars, pigmentation, lumps on their skin, etc. Because they were emphasizing the fact that those initial observations that you make just on the skin's level can tell you quite a lot about the person and their lifestyle. Ended the day with a Microanatomy Lab, so we looked at different kinds of connective tissues, what their purpose is, how it looks on a tissue slide. I think I've said this in a previous video, but histology is, I find it really hard because everything looks the same, but it's fine because we're going to be coming across histology so many times throughout med school, so I'm sure there's enough time for me to get better at it. That's basically the entire 5 days of med orientation week. It definitely was quite full on. I mean, I think in person it would have been even more tiring, but because it was online, it wasn't too bad, I'd say. I think they did a good job with transitioning it into Zoom. Hopefully you got a better idea of what the first week of med school is about, because it's really hyped up for me. I think I hyped it up a lot. And it was really interesting as well, I must say. So I'm going to end the video here. If you guys have any questions, just put them in the comments below and I will go through them and answer. I guess I will see you guys in the next one. Bye!